So thank you very much for attending. My name is Pat Wasley. I'm the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Washington, and what a spectacular day to have this particular event. When the sun shines like this, you know that Jim has done some negotiations, so we appreciate it. So I just wanted to say a few things about the colleges itself and its commitment to international and global education. In addition to dealing with diversity in the United States, the Center for Multicultural Education, which was founded at the University of Washington, is addressing complex questions related to global citizenship and democratic education in diverse multicultural societies. In 2002, the center hosted a conference, Ethnic Diversity and Citizenship Education in Multicultural Education, at the Rockefeller Foundation Study and Conference Center in Bellagio, Italy. We're hoping he'll repeat that, invite all of us. This conference included participants from 12 different nations. The book, Diversity and Citizenship Education, Global Perspectives, contains the major findings of this conference. The center's Bellagio conference was followed up by an international consensus panel that the center convened. The panel's report contains principles and concepts that can be used to structure citizenship education programs that balance unity and diversity. This report, entitled Democracy and Diversity, Principles and Concepts for Educating Citizens in a Global Age, is used around the world. A Japanese edition of the report was published in 2006. This morning, the center continues its work on global citizenship education and diversity by presenting a lecture by one of the leading scholars in the world on citizenship education and diversity, Professor Audrey Osler from the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. Professor Banks, director of our Center for Multicultural Education, will introduce our speaker. Again, thank you so much for coming. And Jim?
I'd like to thank Dean Wasley for those very good remarks. I'm a little bit jet lagged because I'm at Teachers College Columbia this semester, but it's nice to return to Seattle on a sunny day. I had to come back to introduce my very dear friend and colleague, Professor Audrey Osler. My name is James Banks, as the Dean just told you, in case you didn't know. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 24th symposium of our symposium lecture series. And of course, I'd like to thank the Dean for starting. She has an international vision, a strong commitment to diversity, and I'm so pleased that she took the time from a very busy schedule to join us this morning. So welcome again to our 24th symposium and our symposium lecture series. Past speakers in this series have included Linda Darling Hammond, Shirley Bryce Heath, Elizabeth Cohen, Claude Steele, Guadalupe Valdez, Lisa Delpit, Louis Maul, and Sandra Harding. A complete list of our speakers is found in your program that you should have gotten when you walked in. The purpose of the symposium lecture series is to bring world-class scholars to the University of Washington campus who will share their seminal research and stimulate dialogue among our faculty and graduate students within the College of Education, and an interdisciplinary dialogue across our campus, about ways to increase the academic achievement of students of color and to help all students develop positive racial attitudes. I would like to take this opportunity before introducing our speaker to announce our latest publication called Learning in and Out of School in Diverse Environments. A flyer on this publication is available as you walked in. You can download one free copy from our website, only one please, and you can order the other copies from our center, the hard copies. We asked you to do that because this is a self-sustaining publication program. It actually supports itself. Also, we invite you to take, if you like, a copy of Facing the Challenges, which is at the back of the room, that gives an overview of the center and our work since 1992. Our procedure today: Professor Osler will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. We will then invite your participation in a question and answer session. Professor Audrey Osler is Professor of Education and Director of the Center for Citizenship and Human Rights Education at the University of Leeds and they spell center differently. After all, we revolted, and so we have some unique spellings, or they have some unique spellings, however you want to look at it. She's at the University of Leeds, the UK. She has an international reputation for research and teaching in 3 related fields: international and comparative education, education for human rights, equality and democratic education, and children's rights and student participation. When I searched the world to get someone for our panel on this topic, her name kept popping up continuously. She has worked on projects in sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia that were sponsored by several organizations, including UNESCO, the Carter Center, Amnesty International. Professor Osler is currently completing a European Commission-funded transnational study on citizenship and intercultural learning, and is a principal researcher in a second EC-funded project examining education for European citizenship. In 1999, she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Among her many publications, 16 books at my last count, they include the award-winning Girls in Exclusion, The Education and Careers of Black Teachers, Teachers, Human Rights and Diversity, and Changing Citizenship, Democracy and Inclusion in Education. I am very pleased to welcome my dear colleague and friend, Professor Audrey Osler.
Thank you, Jim, for that very warm welcome. And I would also like to say thank you to everyone in the College of Education who's made me so welcome over the past few weeks. I'm not just here for this seminar and this lecture, but I'm actually here for 3 months, and I hope I won't overstay my welcome in any way, but I've been asking a lot of what might seem trivial questions, and people have been very patient, and I intend to go on asking questions if you can manage to be patient. So thank you all very much for hosting me, and I'd like to thank, as well as Jim, for inviting me today, to thank Walter Parker, who's been my official host here and has been extremely supportive. Thank you. I'm very, very honoured to be given this opportunity to speak in the in the symposium lecture series of the Centre for Multicultural Education, especially when I read the list of names who've spoken. It's a little daunting in some ways to follow all those people. My title this morning is Citizenship, Multiculturalism and Minority Education in Britain, a question of civil rights or human rights. And I've tried to cram a lot into that title, and I know that if I overstay my time in talking on that title, I will spoil our opportunities for discussion. So I'll do my best to work within that framework. But before I begin, I'd just like to say 1 or 2 things about my own journey into this field. And I'll just give you a little bit of autobiographical information, how I got from who I was to the University of Leeds today and here to the University of Washington this morning. I was brought up in a small town in the south of England, very close to London. It's marked on this map. And with my father's family from the local area, and my mother, a newcomer. She came to Britain in 1949 to marry my father. They'd met in Singapore while he was doing national service there. And as far as my mother goes, she's been a British citizen, or perhaps more correctly, from when she was young, a British subject all her life, because she'd begun her life in Sarawak in Borneo. She then, at the age of a very young age, went to live in India, where her family were from, and eventually, at the age of 7, right through to 1949, she was in Singapore. And That's where my grandparents are from Singapore via India. And my mother remained in Singapore throughout the Second World War under the Japanese occupation, when, of course, most British people, that is to say, white British people from the metropolis, returned home. So my mother in 1949, a British subject, arrived in Britain, and she didn't need any immigration papers, she didn't need a special visa. Theoretically, all subjects of the British Empire enjoyed similar rights. I say theoretically, including the right to live in Britain. So it was a bit of a shock to her when she arrived there in 1949, and people were surprised that she could speak English. She was, like them, a child of the empire. And as far as I can tell, her education would have been pretty much the same as she'd have gone to an academically focused school in England. She studied for exams which were set and marked and awarded in Cambridge. So I grew up and went to school in a small town in the south of England where our family was known to everyone. We were just slightly unusual, having one white parent and one parent of colour. Wherever we went, everybody knew us and everybody knew who we were. Of course, migration to Britain began shortly after the end of the Second World War on a fairly large scale. But in its early stages, the new migrants who came mostly, first of all, from the Caribbean, were in the major cities, and we lived in a small town. And about the time I was leaving primary school, elementary school, there were migrants arriving in our area from Pakistan, men at first, and then they were bringing their wives and families. When I was about 13 or 14, our school principal, whose photograph you can see vaguely at the top there in the left-hand corner of the screen, called all the students together in a morning assembly. And he told us that our school was to have 2 new students. And it was explained that these 2 new students were coloured. They came from Ghana. But we were to go home and reassure our parents that this was a one-off. Don't worry, we were told to tell them, there won't be lots of these other children coming from Pakistan. They're not going to pass the exams required to get into the school. It was a grammar school, and you took an examination at 11 to get in. Now, this speech made a strong impression on me, and for several days, those of you who know me will know that I wouldn't let go of something like this easily. I gave it a lot of thought, and I thought about going to speak to the school principal. But in the end, my courage failed me on this occasion. Or perhaps something told me that this really wasn't a very good move. In any case, I said absolutely nothing to my parents, who I knew would have been really very, very angry if they found out what had been said. Now, we knew this new family. The children had fled Ghana with their mother, who was, I think, Scottish and white, and there'd been a political coup, and their father, who was a member of the government, had been arrested and, as far as I can remember, imprisoned. And I realised, I think, at that time, for the first time as I recall, that racism was not just about nasty children shouting rude names, nor was it about the terrible anti-immigration rhetoric on the radio and television, which got repeated in respectable adult conversations of the time. It was also something rather more insidious. Now, I'm sure our school principal felt himself to be terribly liberal in accepting these children, but I understood that what was going on had something to do with power, and it had something to do with who belonged and who didn't belong. And our school principal was a very powerful figure in my little world. Now, one of these 2 new students, interestingly, went on to be head boy. He went on to represent the school at important functions. And right from school days, he was, like his father, very, very interested in politics. He went on to study law. In 1987, he was elected a Member of Parliament. In 2002, he became the first black cabinet minister to serve in the Blair government, and he's currently British High Commissioner in South Africa. his name is Paul Boateng, and I couldn't find a picture of Paul when he was at school, so you've got a picture of him as he is today. Now, I went on from school to study history, and then I became a teacher, and I started my own teaching career on the outskirts of southeast London in the late 1970s, when the far-right and racist National Front Party were very active. I went from there in the early 80s, mid-80s, and took a job in a multicultural support service in the school district of the city of Birmingham, which is in the English Midlands. And from there I went on to run an NGO and then training courses for teachers. And it's from this background that I moved into academic life and eventually to the University of Leeds. Now, the themes that come from my life, I think I just told that story, and I hope that you will try and make the links between some of the things that I want to go on to say. I want to talk first of all about political discourse on citizenship and multiculturalism. I think you'll recognize one or two of these fellows here. The main one is that you'll know has got his name very clearly marked. Following the attacks of 11th of September 2001 in the United States, and more particularly the London terrorist bombings in 2005, there's been increased public debate in Britain on citizenship, national identity, multiculturalism, and the integration of minorities. And these events and their aftermath, including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, have shifted the focus of political and media discourse on race relations in Britain, and have given an international dimension to public debate about diversity and belonging. Their impact continues to be felt in the world of education, and a range of commentators, including senior government ministers, have chosen to focus on the role of schools in creating a united and cohesive society, and to suggest how the curriculum might focus on Britishness and British values. Now, what I've done is to examine the speeches of an array of senior figures, specifically the speeches of Prime Minister Tony Blair from 1997 to 2006, a key speech made by our current Prime Minister, featured down there in the corner, Gordon Brown, on Britishness that he made at the beginning of 2006. Just before he became Prime Minister, some 18 months before he became Prime Minister. This guy on the left-hand bottom corner is Jack Straw, who's been a key figure in the Blair government. He was a Foreign Secretary and he was Home Secretary, Minister of the Interior, so he's held these key roles. And the one on the left at the top, his name is Trevor Phillips, and he's been chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, which is a government-funded but relatively independent body. So I want to explore how they've dealt with some of these issues around patriotism, belonging, citizenship, religious diversity, and so on. In 2006, some months after the London attacks, Gordon Brown gave a widely reported speech on the future of Britishness, in which he listed shared British values as liberty, responsibility, fairness. And in December of that year, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, identified British values as belief in democracy, the rule of law, tolerance, and equal treatment of all. It's not particularly clear to me what's especially British about these values. They might be the values of any modern democracy, and they're in line with international human rights principles. And I think this was acknowledged by Jack Straw MP in an article in which he argues that British nationality is based on common civic values. And he says, the values I've talked about are not exclusively British or even indeed Western. They are common human values in the Charter of the United Nations. What is uniquely British about them is the process by which these principles and ideals were gradually applied here. Now, Straw argues that to strengthen citizenship and properly understand these values in the UK, that we need to tell the British story of democracy so that we can understand through history how democracy has developed in the UK context. Nevertheless, these democratic civic values are, I would agree with Straw 100%, are the ones expressed in the UN Charter and expounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in subsequent human rights instruments ratified by the British government. Now, Straw, like Brown, argues that these values are contextualized through history, and thus an understanding of contemporary citizenship in his eyes implies a degree of historical knowledge. And if we accept this argument, then apply it to the school curriculum, then education for citizenship and history education are inextricably linked. And then Gordon Brown goes on to set out his ideas about how this should work within a historical context. And he thinks that we are a country that suffered a kind of crisis of confidence following loss of empire and other developments in the post-1945 period. And he argues that if Britain is to engage with the rest of the world, this is what he thinks we should do. When we take time to stand back and reflect, it becomes clear that to address almost every one of the major challenges facing our country, and it's interesting what he identifies as the major challenges, our relationships with Europe, America, and the rest of the world, how we equip ourselves for globalization, the future direction of constitutional change, a modern view of citizenship, and of course our community relations and multiculturalism, and since July the 7th London bombings, the balance between diversity and integration. Even the shape of our public services, you must have a clear view of what being British means, what you value about being British, and what gives us purpose as a nation. Now, Brown's concept of Britishness is rooted in a vision of a nation-state which takes a leading role in world politics and in the global economy, and it's quite an ambitious role for a small nation. It's a both-and rather than either-or vision. Britain can be conceived both as a successful individual nation-state and as a member of the European Union, and that's quite a controversial issue in Britain, and it can defend its own interest and be a member of NATO. And I think that Brown essentially presents us with the cosmopolitan vision. He doesn't present cosmopolitanism and patriotism as two incompatible positions. Although this is a speech about Britishness, he gives considerable attention to local and international issues. He acknowledges Britain in the world, but he also stresses the importance of neighbourhoods, towns, villages, and communities in shaping identity. However, when he turns his eyes to the school curriculum and to the role of history in schools, all this global picture and the local picture disappears. Brown asserts that we need to discover and build from our history, and we shouldn't recoil from our national history. Rather, we should make it more central to our education. And he thinks that British history should be given more prominence in the curriculum, not just dates and places, not just unconnected facts, but a narrative that encompasses our history. And when I looked at what he saw about our history, he talked about a golden thread of liberty. And he says, before America discovered liberty, we had it. And he says, right, the first thing was 1215, King John signs Magna Carta at Runnymede. Then William of Orange signs the Bill of Rights in 1689. There were 4 great Reform Acts, and you've got one of them illustrated there in a cartoon, which I don't think is particularly clear, but I think it's winning the Derby race in 1867, and one politician has beat the other to the finishing line, and then the British government accountable to the people. Interestingly, world history is not there. Even the passing of the Human Rights Act 2000 a significant constitutional change which incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights. Remember, he's talking about greater liberty, greater rights, and so on. All this is overlooked. It's curious because he's been a leader in constitutional change. He doesn't mention the empire. Nor does he acknowledge that British imperial history might look rather different depending on whether you look from the centre or from the margins. There's a narrowing of vision when we move from the grand vision to proposals for the school curriculum, and the overall political discourse about a cosmopolitan nation, an important role in the world, narrows down to a national story. We need to look inwards in order to regain confidence and take our place amongst the leading nations. History is presented as an onward march towards democracy, and Brown acknowledges that there's still much to be achieved in strengthening democracy through constitutional reform. But past struggles for rights are completely overlooked after, I think, the Reform Acts of the 19th century. There's nothing about women's struggle for rights, and even when Brown's emphasis on the successful economic relations with other nations, there's no suggestion that people need to be prepared for this engagement by understanding or learning from other cultures and ways of thinking, the economic argument for understanding diversity. The sole goal seems to be to understand British values through British history. Now, he doesn't leave it there. He also talks about a new form of patriotism. Now, although patriotism is a concept regularly invoked in the United States, it does tend to be avoided in Britain and other Western European countries, where it's too readily associated with fascism and ethno-nationalism of the 1930s and with the extreme right today. Brown's arguing for a new kind of patriotism and says, and just as in wartime a sense of common patriotic purpose inspired people, so in peacetime a strong modern sense of patriotism and patriotic purpose which binds people together can motivate, inspire. And this British patriotism, in my view, is founded not on ethnicity nor race, but not just on institutions we share and respect, but on enduring ideals which shape our view of ourselves and our communities. Okay, so he's arguing that patriotism has the potential to be progressive, and drawing on George Orwell, he criticises those on the left who've eschewed patriotism and allowed it to be defined by conservatives as reactionary, a defence of backward-looking institutions, xenophobic, and a self-interested individualism. Patriotism is linked to democracy, even though the nature of the links are not explored in detail, and the overall emphasis seems to be on participation and civic engagement. It's assumed that, that if you feel patriotic, you'll want to get involved. Now, what is interesting is then how they deal with multiculturalism. The theme of a modern Britain is developed by Prime Minister Blair's speech in December 2006, which formed one of a series of lectures on our nation's future. And he asserted at this speech, which I was fortunate enough to attend, that multiculturalism was still part of our agenda. Now, this is very significant because Trevor Phillips, who is the chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, has told us that we should be abandoning multiculturalism. Phillips, as I said in 2005, he was warning in the media that we are sleepwalking our way to segregation. We're leaving communities to be marooned outside the mainstream. Now, drawing on the experience of the United States and on the example of the poor and predominantly African-American victims of Hurricane Katrina, Phillips warned of the dangers of a segregated, unequal society in which the average black child attends a largely black school and the average white person returns home to a largely white suburb. He's warning us that if we pursue our multicultural agenda, we're going to follow the United States down this particular route. And this is what he says that we should think about. He says that Britain has a different concept of integration from the US. And he says, for all of us who care about racial equality and integration, America is not our dream, but our nightmare. Therefore, I think the focus is purely on equal rights for different groups. Amongst America's hyphenated identities, the part of their identity that marks them out as different seems to become as important, even more important, than the part that binds them together. Now, that's Philip's observation, and I don't feel competent to comment on that, and I'd be interested to know how you understand that. But for Phillips, it's shared values which bind us together, and he again cites similar values to the others, but he also adds our common traditions, a common language, good manners, care of children, and ironic humour. He considers these all to be very, very British. He argues that diverse lifestyles compatible with these common values are fully accepted in contemporary Britain. Nobody tells us, he says, how to speak, how to dress, what we should eat, or how we should worship. And he argues that a model of multiculturalism which is relativist and which would permit behaviour such as child cruelty and abuse in the name of cultural or religious freedom is what we need to be wary of. Now, I'd like to just discuss with you this critique of multiculturalism as practiced in Britain, because one problem with Phillips's critique is it's been taken up by media commentators, particularly on the right, and used to back a call for uniformity and assimilation, and his ideas have been taken out of context. And in a context where Islamophobia is flourishing in Britain, the call for uniformity by sections of the media amount to an attack on Muslims, and they're portrayed as, by a number of writers, as a homogeneous group and threatening our values and our way of life. In fact, the structural inequalities and poverty that go a lot closer to explaining the segregation that does exist in our neighbourhoods and our cities, although I would judge from the statistics that is not as an acute an issue in Britain currently as it is in some areas of the United States. Now, a second difficulty lies in Philip's suggestion that multiculturalism has failed. If something's failed, you give up. If something needs changing or tweaking or revising, you work at it. But what's interesting is that we've never really had a multicultural policy at national level in Britain as they have had, for example, in Canada. This is not a policy we've tried. So what hasn't been tried can't really be said to have failed. We have had efforts in education, but they've not been uniform, and they've not been consistent across the country. Multiculturalism, for example, can't be explained for segregation in certain parts of our university sector, which has been very, very slow to meet its legal obligations for race equality. But the sector has never embraced multiculturalism, so that's not the cause of that problem. Within the field of education, faith schooling in Britain has expanded under the Labour government. The Christian churches played a very important part in the establishment of mass education in Britain, and so we have publicly funded church schools. 1/3 of our schools are church schools. Christian schools that are church schools tend to have a particular ethos, but they don't tend to promote the religion in a direct way. That's true of most of them. When the Labour Party came to power in 1997, there were over 6,000 faith schools, less than around 1 in 3 of our schools, and the vast majority are elementary schools. In 1998, we have had 2 Islamic elementary schools that became part of the state system, part of the publicly funded system, and following an Act of Parliament in 2005, we have increased opportunities for faith organisations to establish schools. Now, this hasn't been promoted as a multicultural policy. This has been promoted as a policy of equity between religions. If you have Christian schools, they've argued, therefore, we will have Islamic schools, we will open up opportunities. We've always had some Jewish schools, we'll open up opportunities for Hindu schools and Sikh schools and so on. I spent this summer travelling across England and visiting different cities, looking at schools and community cohesion. schools, regardless of their faith or non-faith background, have an obligation, two legal obligations. One is an obligation to promote race equality. All our schools have that, and all our schools from September 2007 have now an obligation to promote community cohesion. Now, a third critique of Phillips, I would say, is that he lies in the appeal to common values about identifying the basis of those values. While Britain does have a common language, it might be equally characterised as a multilingual nation state comprising many bilingual and multilingual communities. The evidence does not support the special British tradition of caring for children. In fact, in 2007, a UNICEF report placed Britain bottom of the League of Industrialised Nations in its care of children. And somebody said to me the other day, well, you have much better legal protection for children in the UK than we do in the US. Well, this survey didn't just look at the indicators of relating to legal and social and economic conditions, but actually asked children about their own sense of well-being. So US children must have felt much more positive about life than British children. Representations of Islam. Just 1 year after Phillips made his speech claiming in the UK we can dress as we like, we can eat as we like, and so on, a senior government figure, Jack Straw, MP for Blackburn, where Muslims make up about a quarter of voters, claimed that wearing the niqab to conceal the face could be seen as a visible statement of separation and difference, and is bound to make positive relations between the two communities more difficult. He wrote that he suggested that asking women to consider showing their mouths and noses led to more effective communications. His remarks were widely reported around the world. Significantly, there is a link between this new popular discourse around multiculturalism and that which focuses on women, Muslim women, the dress that some, few of them, choose to wear. We're asked to consider the implication for community relations and community cohesion of both multiculturalism and of the niqab. In this discourse, both multiculturalism and the niqab are associated with separation, with problems of communication between communities. And Muslim communities, particularly Muslim women, are seen as isolating themselves, and multiculturalism and Islam, through specific symbols, are both blamed for causing us to live parallel lives. If women wearing the niqab, or indeed the hijab, are so isolated and unable to communicate, how do we explain away their presence in the supermarket queue, as university students, and working in our schools? Mondal, a British colleague, has argued that the apparent crisis in multiculturalism may reflect the fact that Islam itself is seen as a problem. Islam is the limiting case for multiculturalism, testing some citizens' duty to integrate and sign up to British values. And Gordon Brown reminds us that we have to face uncomfortable facts that there were British citizens, British-born, apparently integrated into their communities, who were prepared to kill and maim their fellow British citizens, irrespective of their religion. And he says, July the 7th has led the calls for all of us, including moderates in the Islamic community, to stand up to extremism. Terrorism in our midst means that debates, which sometimes may be seen as dry about Britishness and our model of integration, clearly now have a new urgency. Now, just as Tony Blair asserted that the British were not going to be taken for a ride by extremist Muslims, we have other European nation states who also see Islam as a threat to their way of life. So we have French Republican values threatened by schoolgirls who wear headscarves. We have the Dutch questioning their model of liberal tolerance and revealing, I think, their everyday racism, which targets Muslim citizens as outsiders. And we have the Danish media dividing Danes into two categories: Danes, who uphold Danish values, and other Danes, labelled Muslims, who threaten those values. And I found a nice picture of the Little Mermaid dressed there in Muslim clothes. Okay, this is the discourse. What about legal framework in the UK? Where do we actually stand? In order to contextualise the discourse, I think it's important to look at that. Importantly, the Labour government introduced new legislation in the form of the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, which was a very, very important race relations development. It covers the government, it covers armed forces, and it requires all public bodies, including schools, as I've said, to promote race equality. The legislation followed the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report, which identified institutional racism in British society. And what happened was that shortly after the Labour government came to power in 1997, and following pressure from the family and friends of the Lawrence family, the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, ordered an inquiry into the murder on the streets of London in 1993. So it took, all those years of Conservative administration. There was no inquiry into why the police had failed to bring to trial young men who'd been identified as the murderers quite early on. There was evidence. All the evidence was lost, and a newspaper, the Daily Mail, put the photographs of the five accused young men on the front page and said, if you think, if you're not the murderers, take us to court. They're a good. And they weren't able to, but nobody's ever been convicted for this murder. So the Stephen Lawrence inquiry report, the government inquiry, found institutional racism in all walks of British life, and including the police service and education. It came up with 70 recommendations. Unfortunately, and the Prime Minister agreed with this, the opposition parties, everybody stood up at that point. All our political leaders said, we have institutional racism, this is shocking, we're going to do something about it. They came up with the Race Relations Amendment Act, but this legal mechanism has not been fully implemented. For example, there have been concerns expressed amongst schools. Our school inspectors noted that in 2004, school districts would I think it was a quarter of school districts were not meeting their obligations under the law. So what follows then, no, I don't want to go there. What follows this then is looking at the speeches of Prime Minister Tony Blair. What I've observed is that before 2001, he made, although education was his priority, he made, I think it was just 5, I have to check now because I'm not reading, 5 speeches on that referred to multiculturalism, referred to diversity. None of them were linked to education. After 2000, and all of them were directed to minority audiences, not to mainstream or powerful audiences. After 2001, he made 2 speeches which were directed at mainstream audiences, and the speech which I attended, which for the first time in a programme which the government has invested loads and loads of money, it's been priority education, it's done some very impressive things in education and some problematic things, but issues around values, multiculturalism were completely missing until 2006, 6 months before he resigned as Prime Minister. And the focus changed after 2001, and we see an international act of terrorism changing that focus. And the implications of his new speeches on immigration are that immigrants need a reminder of their duties and obligations, even though we've got clear evidence that migrants are fulfill their duties as often as others. But then he actually acknowledges that. But there's a huge difficulty there, because he's trying to appeal to all voters. He's trying to appeal to voters on the left, on the right, in the middle, and he's appealing to the far right sometimes, across the range of the political spectrum. And he claims that the vast bulk of British people are not racists. And in his 2006 speech, he says He says, racism's been kicked out of sport. Offensive remarks and stupid stereotypes have been driven out of public conversation. The basic courtesies have been extended to all people. Institutional racism is off the agenda. It's all about being nice to each other. So we're not racist because we're always very polite to each other. So I would argue that there's no real understanding of structural racism, but there are contradictions here and there are hopeful signs. And this guy, Dara Singh, has just chaired a commission on integration and cohesion, and it's much stronger on questions of social justice. And he says integration and cohesion policies cannot be a substitute for national policies to reduce deprivation and provide people with more opportunities. Tackling inequality is an absolute precondition for integration and cohesion. So that's the response. How does all this fit with citizenship education in England? Well, citizenship education has been introduced, what you would probably call civics education, for a number of reasons. In the context of global injustice and inequality, that's acknowledged, globalization and migration, concerns about levels of civic and political engagement. So the young are not supposed to be voting and so on, and they do vote at lower levels than their elders, but these things seem to correct themselves. And a perceived youth deficit, we blame the young for the problem, expresses a double deficit when we talk about minority communities. They have twice the difficulty in coping, and concerns about the growth of anti-democratic and racist movements. All these things affected our citizenship education program, and now security. Citizenship education and the education of minority and majority students in England, we've had two main reports. One is a Crick report in 1998, and it emphasised political literacy, and I would argue that although the report had a lot of problems, but that is an adequate framework for addressing diversity. But unfortunately, he was extremely patronising about minorities. They had to learn to obey the laws and conventions. We see a reflection of the political discourse here. And majorities must learn tolerance. So two different requirements for two different groups. In this year, 2007, we had a new report, the Ejegbo report, adds a new strand on identity and diversity living together in the UK. But this totally lacks a critical approach. Totally, it's about celebrating our identities. And it gives a lot of emphasis to celebrating white identities. It seems to have misunderstood quite a lot of the work on critical race theory and so on, and says, oh yes, white people need to have their identities celebrated, and that will be all nice and we'll all be happy together. What we have done is to work with students and to learn from them. These are some photographs taken by young people when we've asked them to say what's important in their communities. And these are the photographs they've shown us and then captioned and given us a lot of information. It's quite clear to me that young people do have a strong local identity, they have a strong global identity. They don't really necessarily, at the ages we looked at, which was from 10 right through to 18, have a lot of interest in defining themselves in the context of Britain. I think we would find different results in Scotland and Wales, smaller countries, where they would go for Scotland or Wales as an identity. I'd just like to look at history and the imagined nation. In 1987, we celebrated Britain's first black MPs, and left to right along the top there, you can see my school chum, Paul Boateng, Bernie Grant, Keith Vaz, Diane Abbott. But along the bottom row, we have Robert Banks Jenkinson MP, Lord Liverpool, who was Prime Minister from 1812 to 27. It's a long time, perhaps we'd consider far too long. The longest serving British Prime Minister. He was of Indian and white British descent. Naroji, a Liberal MP, that should be 1892 to 95. Balnagri, Conservative MP, 1895 to 1905. And Saket Vala, MP, in the early 20th century, first a Labour MP and then a communist. These are all lost. Similarly, I studied history at university. I studied history all the way through school. I was shocked to find that the first woman to study law at the University of Oxford, the first woman to study law in Britain, the first barrister in Britain was an Indian woman, Cornelia Sarabji. And I was even more amazed because I'd seen loads of photographs of suffragettes in school textbooks, both my own and more recent, that we had Indian women leading the suffragette movement, completely vanished. And they're not on Mr. Brown's agenda for our history curriculum. I think that I want to say a little bit to conclude about human rights as the principles for underpinning civics or citizenship education, and to say that civil rights, I think, are a very, very important step towards securing equality, but these political rights need to be matched by social, economic and cultural rights to work. And another reason why I think human rights need to underpin our curriculum in multicultural Britain today is because not all students in our classrooms are British citizens. But they all do have rights, and they all are protected under the European Convention on Human Rights, regardless of nationality. Now, Bhikkhu Parekh argues that we can refer to British shared values only insofar as we can say the UK has decided to commit to these values and in this sense take up ownership of them. Now, the UK has made a commitment to human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, and subsequently the Convention on the Rights of the Child 1989, the European Convention on Human Rights. It builds on the Universal Declaration and gives strength and power and legal force to many of those rights. If we accept Parekh's claim about human rights and shared values, we can see that these are the shared values which we can work with. Parekh notes, however, that while the international community has achieved a consensus on human rights, certain cultures and nations give emphasis to some rights, certain cultures and nations continue to give emphasis to other rights. But what he's suggesting, and what I would agree with, is that we need to develop a dialogue so that we begin to engage and understand those different perspectives. Human rights, I think, offer us a broad set of universal principles that set the framework for that dialogue. Some of us use human rights as a basis for our values. Others may explain their values in terms of religious beliefs. Some countries, the constitution is a source of shared values. But within the broad human rights framework, which nations and non-governmental organisations have subscribed and achieved consensus, a dialogue is possible. And that's why I would argue that human rights education needs to underpin civics in all these contexts. There's an urgent need for engagement to explore the ways in which education, specifically citizenship education, allows individuals and communities with different experiences, values and perspectives to engage with each other, opening up our institutions, organisational arrangements and public policies to a multicultural critique. Without a dialogue, we're in danger of defining Britain as a multicultural society which imposes a monocultural citizenship on its members. I've argued that human rights must underpin the curriculum, but our everyday citizenship is most commonly experienced at the local level. Individuals with multiple and changing allegiances to local, national and transnational communities are there. Educators can't assume that students will identify first and foremost with the nation. The various communities that young people identify are likely to reflect a range of values and beliefs, both religious and secular. And I believe we need to develop a citizenship curriculum which builds upon the growing body of research in the areas of critical multiculturalism, critical pedagogy and human rights education too. Finally, the diversity we encounter in Britain is not clearly unique to ourselves. Processes of globalization and changing patterns of migration are having an impact on societies across the globe. There's a global scale to many of the challenges we face, including the eradication of poverty and climate change. For the young people of the 21st century, it's mistaken, I would argue, to conceptualise citizenship learning and citizenship experience within the framework of the nation state. Technological advances, processes of globalisation, and importantly, the lived experiences of many young people suggest that this model is outmoded and needs to be revised. And our research shows that some young people are already developing cosmopolitan citizens whose life choices and political behaviours will have an impact beyond the borders of the nation state. And when I'm conceptualising cosmopolitan citizenship, I'm conceptualising the nation as cosmopolitan, the local community as cosmopolitan, as well as this global context. It's not an alternative to education for national citizenship or another term for what is commonly referred to as global citizenship education. Instead, I think it requires us to reimagine the nation as cosmopolitan and to recognise local communities as cosmopolitan. It implies a sense of solidarity with strangers in distant places, but it also requires solidarity, a sense of shared humanity, and a dialogue with those in the local community and the national community whose perspectives may be very different from our own. Thank you.